It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, just by emailing me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like our show, be sure and check out our Patreon. Everything you hear Monday to Friday, AM/FM radio, you can hear on Patreon, ad-free. We cut the commercials out. And I just hired some people to come in and help me upload like 9 months worth of content. So no more complaining about that, okay? We're going to have content up every single night for you. Our archives you could find at Spreaker.com, and you can sign up there for free. You get an email notification anytime I put up new content. That's where I do a live show Friday nights, a live solo show, and there's also a chat room. But the most important thing is you can go to Spreaker.com, and you can put in the name of our guest, Heather Braden, and she's been on 2 times previously because she's intimately connected with all these people in the news, like Trump and Epstein and Jean-Luc Brunell. As a matter of fact, she was in a documentary in the United Kingdom in England called Is Trump a Sex Pest? She's the one that put me in touch with Barbara Pilling, who was actually hit on by Trump when she was a young teen. So Heather Braden is really tuned into all this stuff behind the scenes. Heather Braden, are you there?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. Remind the audience, who is Heather Braden, and just touch briefly on what we discussed the last couple of times you've been on the show.
Sure. I basically am a lifelong model. I started at age 14. I was started by being scouted by Eileen Ford and several other agencies at the time, and that was in the late 80s when I was 14. So I basically left and went to New York without my parents' permission, chasing this dream of what I'd seen in the, media. And I found my way there and was just kind of thrown into this world of these powerful predators. And I spent the next 15 years really modeling until I was about age 30, pretty full-time. And then I also, started as a photo assistant and ended up as a photographer and a producer down the line, and still a model. I'm still a model today. Even though I am, doing different types of things than I was at that time, I still have agencies in several cities. And so obviously this really struck home because it's kind of been my lifelong, situation.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question now, because you talk about how you went to New York City when you were like 14, 15 years old. And you hear these stories, especially when I talked to the attorney that was suing a Trump modeling agency about that. I believe the girl was from Haiti. She was a teen girl from Haiti. Right. You know the story,
Yep.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And you hear that they have these studio apartments. Many of them were in the building owned by Jeffrey Epstein's brother, okay? And there would be like bunk beds in there with like 6 girls packed into one little tiny, and then they're overcharged for their rent and their FedEx and their limos and their makeup. Were you ever taken advantage of it that way?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. All of us were really. I mean, I spent years living in models' apartments in New York for multiple different types of multiple different agencies, and they were all the same. And usually, and of course, mind you, we're 15 and 14. We had no idea about anything in the world, and now obviously I do. But so we were living in these apartments, and in one situation, it's a 2-bedroom apartment. It was right by the World Trade Center, and there were 4 beds in one room, and there was 2 or 3 in another room, and they were all full at all times. And then in the living room, I actually was sleeping on the pull-out sofa. And at this point, I was a little bit older. And most girls, they come in and out of the system so fast, like 3 months or a year maximum. They're either, too distraught to continue, or they just can't hack it with their personalities, or worse things happen, like other, scenarios where they've been abused, or they just, so they're in and out. It's a super transient situation. And, but at this point I was older and I had stayed in New York. I didn't have anything to go back to, where I was from. So I kept living in models' apartments, because your option is either you live in a model's apartment or you get a rich boyfriend who then like saves you from that world of the model apartment, and or you just get a real job. And to do that in New York is so difficult, most just don't. So those are kind of like the three routes that you go once you come to the New York. So I lived in the model apartment extended times because I didn't want to do any of the other things, and that was my option. So I was one of the oldest at some points, and the new girls would come at age 12, 13, 14, 15. Most of the girls in the models apartments were minors, almost all of them, and then, you get a little bit older and you had boyfriends or you were working in the industry. And of course, as the young ones, you were also a target either way. But yeah, so I was living on the sofa bed, pull out, and 7, 8, 9 girls, teenagers. There was a lot of drama, a lot of crying, a lot of tears, a lot of drugs, and a lot of just drama with all this scenario. Most of the girls were foreign. Their passports were held by the agencies. Of course, it's under the guise of safety so that they didn't lose them in the event they had a last-minute job. But the reality is most jobs just weren't international for most girls at that point. So really that was probably part of their, forced work because you really couldn't, they also had you on a stipend every week. So you'd get, $50, $100 if you were good and you negotiated, maybe you could get $150 a week to live off of. Most of the time they made you advance that money. It was a loan.
All right.
And if you were lucky and you were doing some editorials, they paid almost nothing. So, you easily racked up a humongous debt with the agency. And yes, they charged $1,200, $1,800 a month for the right to live like that.
And this is the standard practice, Casablancas, Elite, Trump modeling agency, all these, this is how they do it. Okay. Because they're all following the exact same handbook because they all know each other.
Right. And in one sense, a lot of these agencies are running a legitimate side. So either way, it kind of benefits both angles, like your legitimate angle and your dirty business on the side, because you do need a place to put girls because they are advancing some money and or an opportunity, let's say. But the majority, the vast, vast majority don't ever do much with their career. It's really, it's a numbers lottery game. So they just do it as cheap as possible. It's like racehorses. You just train 100 and see how many you have left in 6 months.
Yeah, and real quick, when I used to live in Vegas, and I used to talk about this on the air, that we had one of those model apartments in our condo complex.
No way.
Oh no, yeah, and the girls, and they used to look at me like, oh, the dad, hey, we got a flat tire, what do we do? They would come to me, and I was so naive though. I really didn't think them being taken advantage of, and I'd see them coming in with their boxes of wine. They'd buy boxes of wine every night, and but they were all over 20, that's for sure, and
right.
But the other thing, too, was just like you said, constant turnover. There was 6 girls living in this apartment constantly, the new one all the time. And in Vegas, there's a lot of trade shows and conventions. So I know they worked for that a lot, too. They did those jobs on the side, So, but remind the audience, so the last 2 times you were here, you were telling us about the documentary you were involved in in England about the Is Trump a Sex Pest? So what kind of stories did you tell us back then? Because you're here today to tell us about Jean-Luc Brunell, who you worked for. Now, right, okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, and they're all tied in, but the Trump story was essentially one of my agents. It wasn't actually Jean-Luc Brunel's agency, but it was another agency that forced me to go to Trump's house under the fake guise that it was a client networking event that I was requested for because he had some, business and he was looking for models, and that was always kind of what it was. And I was essentially forced to go there under the threat of being sued or kicked out of my agency and sued. So, and that was where it was Trump and 50 girls and some A-list actors, 3 or 4 of them, and just preying on young girls, most of them Eastern Bloc, who didn't speak English, who were clearly probably minors. And, that was one of 1,000 similar type things that I've been forced to go to over the years.
Right.
And that was probably one of the last I was really forced to go to, forced, because I was a bit older already at that point.
And those A-list actors have never been identified?
No.
Haven't they been sort of?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. I'm really, to be honest, I'm really frightened to talk about that because And these guys were on the scene all the time in Miami. Even if you just Google like model party Miami, 80 or 90s or 2000s and celebrities, you'll see the same guys popping up in the articles, and you'll kind of get the gist of who it was, because it's the same guys that were always there.
Gotcha.
And they were in the news for being there, but this was a more private thing.
Well, I'm sure you've been following the Jean-Luc Brunell story because how did you first come in contact with the man?
So when I was 14, Eileen Ford came to my little hometown in Oregon and had posted up signs. Somebody had posted up posters that she was looking for, she was scouting for models. Somehow I knew what that was from like Interview Magazine. And I had done one hair show for a hair thing, and it was really fun.
Yeah.
I was 13 when I did the hair show. And so when she came into town, I went and met her. And she immediately offered me a contract, and I was in touch with her after that. Now, there were a couple other agents I met right around that time as well in my hometown. So, these people would go town to town looking. And so I ended up, remaining in contact with her, and she wanted me to go straight to Paris and set me up with a contract with Jean-Luc. I would go to Paris and live with him and go with Karen's Paris, which is a big deal because Karen's was a legitimate agency as well, and he was definitely a developer of models and careers. But, like the bodegas, there's the front and there's another world underneath it, and in his case anyway. And so, yeah, I was slated to go there to Paris with him. I was really excited because I wanted out of my little town. I had big ambitions to live all over the world. Specifically, I wanted to live in Paris more than anything. So, of course, that was the best, offer for me. And then just a few days before I went, a girlfriend of mine who'd just gone to Paris modeling, she was maybe a year or so older, about 16. And I don't know how, her parents must have obviously let her go and, arranged her passport and everything. And she came back, and, when I told her that I was going, and I couldn't believe she'd come back early, only 2 months later, she basically broke down in tears and ended up telling me the story about her agent, Jean-Luc, who had drugged her and raped her. Mm. And she'd woken up in his bed in the morning after being at the Club Bandouche in Paris and swore that the bartenders must have been in on it because she said she had the drink at the bar with him, and she wasn't a drinker. He was just kind of forcing her to have a drink. And so she had only drank, she said, about half of the drink. And she was 16. She wasn't a party girl. And sure enough, she woke up on the bed, tied up with scarves the next morning, and left and came running home. That's what you would do. You would just go running home to your parents. Mm. And so that was it. She was out of the industry, and it really echoes the other girl, his victim. I forget her name now, Thaishia, who has been the main victim of his in the Paris situation. It's been going on. And it's a very similar story to hers. She had just been there, and same thing basically happened. So I knew his name, and I was absolutely terrified. That's really the first story I'd really ever heard about somebody raping somebody. I didn't really know a lot about that. And so I was pretty terrified, and I was on alert. And to my mind, I was like, okay, I'm never going to Paris with this guy, Jean-Luc. Mm. But, I just kind of figured he's like one out of, hundreds and hundreds, and he's just the one bad apple. So I went to New York, and I went with another agency because I basically blew off Ford Models because she kept saying I had to go to Paris and I had to go with Jean-Luc. And this was, I don't remember if it's right at, just before or when that 60 Minutes episode came out, American Girl in Paris, which was all about Eileen Ford and Jean-Luc and these other allegations, and girls like Courtney Powell, who'd already made allegations against him. And it was right at that time. I'd have to double check the dates, see if it was right before or right after. I think it might have been right before. But obviously Eileen Ford had already heard these allegations. She was already aware of the stories. Now, I know she was a very professional woman, but I think, a lot of them, people would just turn a blind eye to the stories because, there's also a legitimate side. So, but it was well known among models, over the next years. And for the next 10 years, as I tried to avoid Jean-Luc, the irony of it all is everywhere I went, there was Jean-Luc, He ended up being my agent on 3 different occasions, but